produced goods, and we used more goods than we produce. And how can you do that? You can do that if someone else produces goods and uses less than they produce, and they sell you the goods that were the surplus for them. And that's what the rest of the world has been doing. Recently, and for a number of years now, over $500 billion of goods a year have been coming into the U.S. in excess of the goods that we've sent out of the country. So all these poor countries like China and places like that, they're busting their butts to produce goods, and then they're shipping more goods to us than they're getting back in return. And that allows us to live beyond our means. But folks, that can only go on so long, okay? And let me assure you, say, well, why would the Chinese give us all those goods and not get as much in return? And the answer is, of course, that we give them IOUs. And let me assure you that if they were willing to cut off their nose to spite their face and said, we want to collect on those IOUs now, we're just going to sell them, interest rates in the United States would go through the roof. They would be at all-time highs. The economy would collapse, and the value of the dollar would collapse. The Chinese, right now, could destroy the American economy. It would hurt them, but they could do it. We've put ourselves in that position. But to go on, how did we get in this current mess that we have? Well, the current mess that we have comes about because we have been misallocating scarce resources. We have been using scarce resources to produce goods and services that in a free market wouldn't have been produced, where the resources that went to produce them would have been used to produce other things. So what has happened is we have channeled unbelievable amounts of resources into overproduction of houses and overproduction of automotive vehicles, but particularly large SUVs. Now, why did that come about? How did that come about? Well, you need to go back in history a little bit. In 1913, this Federal Reserve System that I had up here was created, okay, by the federal government. The Rockefeller and Morgan interests got together at Jekyll Island, which is an island off the coast of Georgia, the east coast of Georgia. And Georgia doesn't have any other coast but the east coast. But at any rate, got together off the east coast of Georgia and put together this bill, and it got through Congress, and Congress created this private banking cartel. And from day one, what it did was allow them to inflate the money supply. But there were restraints on them inflating the money supply. And the reason was, at that time, paper money was backed by gold. So if they started printing too much paper money, people would take the paper money into their banks and say, give me gold. And the banks would then take the paper money, give them the gold, take the paper money to the government, say, hey, give us the gold. You say, or to the Federal Reserve, say, give us the gold. And so they had to be careful about how much paper money they printed because of the limited supply of gold. But during the Great Depression, now remember, the Federal Reserve comes into existence in 1913. 20 years later, during the Depression in 1933, within a month of being inaugurated as president, Roosevelt says to the people, he says, look, in order to get out of this depression, these really bad times and all that, and one of the emergency measures we need to save the country and all that is you got to turn in your gold. We can't use gold. You've got to turn it in right now for paper money. So in the spirit of patriotism and all that, most people, not the smart ones, but most people turn their gold coins in, and for every eagle, a double eagle, which is a gold coin about that big, weighs just under an ounce, for every eagle they turned in, they got a $20 bill. That's a double eagle. For every eagle they turned in, they got a $10 bill, etc. And why would the people turn their gold in for these pieces of paper? And the answer is simply, everybody thought that Roosevelt says an emergency measure, as soon as he straightens out the depression and it's all over, we'll be able to turn our paper money in and get our gold back. But of course, Roosevelt wasn't about to have any of that, right? He didn't want people using gold money because, gold is a restraint on being able to print money, and being a restraint on the ability to print money, it's a restraint on how much government can spend. And governments love to spend money. Why? It's other people's money. Think about that. You get to spend other people's money for things you want to spend it on. My God, that's wonderful, right? So governments don't like to be restrained. So what Roosevelt did was take all these gold coins and melt them down. So they weren't coins anymore. They were ingots. That was an attempt to prevent the American people from ever going back to gold coin money. I mean, that's the only reason to do it, okay? So he did that. So he started to break the link between gold and paper money, and he did domestically. But with foreigners, he couldn't do that because now we want to import chemicals, say, from Germany or textiles from England or whatever. Well, we could give them paper money as long as they knew they could turn that in for gold. But once they found out they can't turn the paper money in for gold, Katie bar the door. They're not selling us goods for, pieces of paper that have been printed on, right? So Roosevelt has to say, well, okay, Americans, you can't own gold. But, those foreigners, they can turn the paper money in for gold. Except not individual foreigners. If you're an exporter and you sell something to America and you get paper money, well, what you have to do is, through your bank, turn the paper money into your government, and get your own currency from your government, and then let your government turn into paper money for gold. But that seemed to work okay for a while. And then World War II comes along, and of course, the productive capacity of Europe is bombed to hell, and so for Japan and all that. So after the war, those people wanted dollars, and because they wanted to buy stuff. We could produce stuff. They couldn't produce much. They wanted to buy stuff. So any dollars they could get, they didn't want to turn in for gold. They wanted to turn in for goods. And that was great. Until what? Until as they rebuilt their economy, when you rebuild an economy, if you have a blown-up factory, you don't rebuild it with the original technology that was in the factory. You rebuild it with the most modern technology you can find. So all of a sudden, they started to find out that they could produce goods and sell more to us, and in fact, they started selling us more goods than we were able to sell them. And so they were getting these green pieces of paper. And they could turn those green pieces of paper in for gold. But what did we tell them, the government? Don't turn those green pieces of paper in for gold. Why not? Because they're as good as gold. You see, you can turn them in for gold anytime you want, so why bother? Of course, it turns out there's a fellow named Charlie de Gaulle who, for various reasons having to do with World War II, among other things, wasn't particularly enamored of the United States, and particularly when it came to nuclear stuff, he says, is the U.S. going to... We're telling everybody in the world, nobody needs to have their own nuclear weapons. We'll protect you, all of Europe. And de Gaulle says, wait a minute. If the Soviet Union invades here and they start to come after Paris, is the President of the United States really going to use nuclear weapons to stop them when they're going to retaliate against New York and Washington? And he says, no. No American president is going to put New York and Washington at risk to save Paris. That was his answer. So he says, we're going to build our own nuclear weapons, which he did, okay? So So Charles de Gaulle then started, when he would accumulate some paper dollars, enough of them, he turned to us and he'd say, well, you said the paper is as good as gold? Well, I'll tell you what, you take the paper and I'll take the gold. But don't worry about it, the paper's as good as gold, so you have it, so that's great, folks, you see? And so he started to do that, and then some other people started to do it, and all of a sudden American gold stocks started to go down, and then on one of those days of infamy that I shall never forget, August 15th, 1971, because I was a graduate student in economics and I can see it in my mind, Nixon goes on TV and he says, and inflation at that time was about 4% a year, and he says, inflation is so bad, we're putting on wage and price freeze. We're freezing wages and prices throughout America. Oh, and by the way, we're closing the gold window, which is jargon for you foreigners can't turn that paper money in for gold anymore. So any foreigners who had that paper money who thought it was good as gold found out what? America had lied to them. It wasn't as good as gold.